A series of questions are now being raised about whether the crime wardens that have been instituted in Gauteng through the Premier there, Panyaza Lesufi, are in fact legal. The Daily Maverick journalist Mark Heytwood writing this morning that these wardens are illegal. And in fact, the wardens were not given proper training. Meanwhile, in the Western Cape, the province there has been using what are called leap officers. There's some evidence that crime in the Western Cape has started to decline. While generally it's been rising in the rest of the country, you can imagine how political a finding or how contested that might be. Let's get a view now from Brett Herron. He's a Member of Parliament and Secretary-General of the Good Party. Brett, good afternoon to you. Different ways of describing these people. Crime wardens in Gauteng. Under the law, they can be called peace officers, or whatever we want to call them, in two provinces now. There are some questions about their legality. Some people do welcome them. They see them as helping to protect communities. How do you feel about them?
Well, I think, good afternoon, Stephen. The starting point is that they are unlawful. In a reply to a parliamentary question that I posed to the Minister of Justice, he confirms that they're not peace officers. And therefore, if they're not peace officers, they have no policing powers. And in fact, the Criminal Procedure Act says that anything that they do is of no force or effect. So besides the lack of training or the insufficiency of the training, their structure is unlawful. They don't report to a proper command center, and they have not been afforded peace officer powers, as is claimed, particularly in Gauteng by the Gauteng government. In the Western Cape, it's slightly different because the LEAP officers, the Western Cape Safety Plan, has been implemented by the City of Cape Town, and so they are employed as law enforcement officers. But there are portions of the LEAP program that is also unlawful, and in fact, Minister Cele in Parliament called them constitutional delinquents. So how I feel about them is I understand communities are looking for safer environments and hoping that more boots on the ground will make them safer. But undertrained people in uniform without the proper police officer powers or peace officer powers are basically a paramilitary force or a private army or a vigilante group, and extremely dangerous and not necessarily making people safer.
So, I mean, maybe we should treat the two programs separately. I believe that in the Western Cape there was a lot more training than there was in Gauteng. You've explained your views on the legality. I think many people accept your views on the legality. Do you think that they can be made legal? Or do you think maybe in Gauteng it needs to stop, maybe in the Western Cape it needs to stop?
Well, I think that it does raise the question around devolution of policing powers. You have two provinces who have decided that they can no longer rely on the South African police services entirely to provide a safe environment for their communities. And I think that's if you buy into the notion that boots on the ground is the best way to combat crime, rather than addressing the conditions that people live in that are conducive or generate crime in those communities. But let's accept that boots on the ground are helpful. It does raise a question for the national ministers and our national government around their attitude to devolution of policing powers, because we have two provinces who are essentially going it alone. If the programs are successful or can reduce crime, then it poses a dilemma for our government, because on the one hand, they've called the Western Cape and Cape Town constitutional delinquents. On the other hand, their own comrades in Gauteng have now emulated that program to some extent, and it's an unlawful program.
It would seem that there's going to be a lot of debate around this. In the end, Brett, what we really need is for the SAPS to work. And all the experts have told us time and time again it's about leadership in the SAPS, it's about investigative capacity, it's about the fact that before the pandemic, our murder detection rate was under 20%. It's about more detectives, more investigators, and more crime intelligence. I mean, that would be first prize, wouldn't it?
It would be. I mean, obviously, our policing service has got a lot of improvement to do, but it's the whole chain of events. I mean, we also need to look at our prosecuting system and why so few prosecutions take place, what happens to dockets, why the National Prosecuting Authority declines to prosecute so frequently. So I think where there are no consequences for crime will flourish. But crime will also flourish where the socioeconomic conditions, the built environment conditions are also not addressed. So yes, policing needs to be improved drastically. We also need to look at the prosecuting authority and say, are they equipped both financially and in terms of human resources to prosecute to conviction? And what are we doing about the legacy of our country that has left many communities with infrastructure deficits, amenities deficits, poor socioeconomic conditions? So it's not just policing that's going to resolve crime.
Mark Herron, Brett Herron, thank you very much indeed. Excuse me, the Secretary General of the Good Party. Really appreciate the time.